Hello everyone, this is Tom Fox and I'd like to welcome you to episode 250 of the FCPA Compliance and Ethics Report. The FCPA Compliance and Ethics Report is sponsored by the Red Flag Group. The Red Flag Group is a business advisory, information services, and technology firm that helps clients manage risk across 4 key areas. These areas include sales and sales channels. Obviously this means distributors, resellers, partners, sales agents, representatives, and other partners. Suppliers, customers, and human capital, which is employees and contractors. I hope you will check out the Red Flag Group. You can find it at www.redflaggroup.com. In today's episode, which as number 250, I'm really thrilled to have back my good friend Stephen Martin. We take a deep dive into the recently announced Department of Justice Pilot Program. Well, most of the commentators focused on the 3 overriding principles by which the department would consider discounts below the minimum sentencing range, self-disclosure, remediation, and cooperation. Stephen and I took a deep dive into the second of those 2 prongs, which I don't think has been as deeply mined or explored. That is what does it mean to cooperate, and what is the Department of Justice looking for in remediation. This episode is a little bit longer than usual because we had a lot to go into, so it comes in at about 26 minutes. I hope you enjoy it, and thank you very much for listening. Hello, everyone. This is Tom Fox. I'd like to welcome you to this episode of FCPA Compliance and Ethics Report. I am back with my good friend and colleague, Stephen Martin, partner at Arnold & Porter. And I asked Stephen, we did an earlier podcast on the new DOJ Pilot Program, but as I got into it, I really came to understand that there's a lot of meat in there that I don't think Stephen and I really had the opportunity to take kind of a deep dive into. So I asked him if he could take some time and visit with me about what some of the things he saw and has seen that the DOJ talks about and what it might mean for the compliance practitioner going forward. So Stephen, thanks again for visiting with me and my audience.
Oh, no, great to do it. Thanks for inviting me, Tom, this afternoon. It's always fun to be on your podcast.
Oh, well, cool. So, Stephen, the pilot program is really broken down into 3 parts, and I feel like we really explored the first part, which was the broad criteria of self-disclosure, cooperation and remediation, coupled with profit disgorgement in our first podcast. But in the second 2 parts of cooperation and remediation, I really thought that the DOJ put a lot in there that people didn't focus on. So I thought maybe if we could start with cooperation, because that's what you have to do in the middle of an investigation. And it's probably fair for you to say you have sat in investigations, you have sat through investigations, you have heard investigations reported to you when you were a government lawyer, and you probably reported to the government on when you were doing investigations in your in-house counsel role. So I was wondering if, with that vast expertise, if you might be able to take us through some of the things that might be new or at least a different focus from the DOJ. And what I'd like to do is just read from the memo that was released when they had the pilot program, if I could. And it starts with that disclosure on a timely basis of all facts relevant to the wrongdoing at issue, including facts related to the involvement in the criminal activity of a corporation's officers, employees, or agents. And from my perspective, I see the focus on the officers is at least a new focus. Do you see anything new or different from your perspective?
I'm happy to go through each one of these. It's good. I guess the important point is I at least have never been under investigation while I've been in all other aspects of it. That's the upside, right?
Yes.
I think on the first point, it's making sure you report things on a timely basis. A lot of times companies want to slow play things, or they don't conduct the investigation or review or the disclosure very quickly, and that can be problematic. What it really does, I think from a prosecutor standpoint, is it just negatively impacts your credibility right off the bat. And so, timely and efficient production once you've decided to do the self-disclosure is really important. And then the second thing you pointed out, which is, the emphasis on individuals now. They're really, between the Yates memo and this new enforcement plan and guidance, they're making it very clear that they're going to focus, continue to focus, but really emphasize it on the prosecution of individuals.
You Stephen, the next point is generally, if I could call it, a proactive cooperation rather than reactive cooperation. And I guess the thing that kind of struck me here is this really calls for a level of, if not inside knowledge, certainly understanding how a prosecutor would think and what they would expect from you. And I, as you know, I came up from the civil side of things. I don't have that experience that you and others do. But what does really proactive cooperation mean for a prosecutor, and more importantly, someone now who's sitting in either an in-house position or someone like yourself, an outside counsel who might be investigating and negotiating and working with the government in an FCPA enforcement action?
So, proactive cooperation is really just not responding to the DOJ's requests, but it's, conducting your own investigation, coming up with an investigation plan, disclosure of information, being really proactive in how you're approaching this disclosure issue, as opposed to waiting to see what happens with the investigation or subpoenas being issued or, requests specifically coming from the Department of Justice. They have limited resources. They've got lots of different cases going on, so this is one of the ways that they can use, the company and outside counsel to conduct a review investigation. So they're trying to push here on, making sure that you are setting the plan and course of action, which DOJ will approve and monitor, but you're really being proactive about it. And like you said, it really is important then to have, somebody guiding you that understands, what the expectations are of the Justice Department and can hopefully help you get, as much cooperation with them as you possibly could. And that's certainly important in having a, fair and reasonable resolution or declination.
So they also, once again, reemphasize the need for preservation, collection, and disclosure of documents. That I don't think is new, and I think that's probably been commented on and explored quite a bit. But the next one struck me is something.
But people do always make mistakes on that, Tom. Where they don't preserve their documents right off the bat. And so while we all think about legal holds and doing that, you see companies make mistakes on what's inside the hold, what are they doing with third parties, documents, and information, and what I see is they don't have it set up very well to disclose very quickly to the Department of Justice, including compliance program information, actually. So.
Okay. Well, the next one talks about rolling disclosures of information. Could you maybe explain what that means from a prosecutor's perspective?
Yeah, instead of having one main disclosure or waiting until you've finished the investigation and then coming in and, offering up the presentation and report of what the findings were, the Justice Department here is just making it clear that they want to be actively advised of the ongoing status of the investigation throughout the process. And so I think so that they can see what's happening, they can understand what the company's doing, make sure it's on the right plan and following what they had presented to DOJ as the scope of the investigation. But also, monitoring things that are happening to see if they need to expand the investigation, look at other companies, look at other third parties. It just provides them more real-time information.
The next point might be something the government lawyers are familiar with, but I have to say I've not seen this, certainly from my background on the civil side. Let me just read it. Where requested, deconfliction of an internal investigation with the government investigation. Can you explain what that means?
Well, it's, there's a lot of different investigations going on. You see industry, or sector-wide sweeps and looking at it, and so there may be other companies, competitors that are in the middle of investigations as well. And so DOJ is basically here trying to signal that, while your investigation may be important, there may be times where we ask you to stand down, or we're not going to focus on certain issues, or we're going to ask you to look at certain things. You won't know necessarily why we're doing making certain requests for this deconfliction idea, and but we have other things that are happening that we obviously can't tell you about. So I don't think it's going to be a major point, but it's just something for people to keep in their thought process, which is things happen. You report to the DOJ, you give them information, and then it goes into kind of a black box for a long period of time. Then all of a sudden things pick up again.
So the next one says provision of all facts relevant to potential criminal conduct by all third-party companies and third-party individuals. And I guess my question to you is, how would a corporation or yourself from an outside counsel position be able to talk about third parties to the DOJ?
Well, I mean, there's the expectation from the Department of Justice that, as part of your compliance program, you will have a robust third-party due diligence process and, and review. So they're going to expect that you know who your third parties are and you're dealing with them. You should have information about them, including, who are the individuals running those third parties, what are the corporate structures, what are the document information that you have from a compliance or legal standpoint, what you're paying them. I mean, there's all kinds of information that you have. And they really, to get to the heart of the corruption issues, understand that third parties are, 80%, you'll know better than I do now, but the number 80% roughly of these FCPA settlements involve third parties. And so they're major issues, and they want to get to the people that are actually, committing these violations as well, that are around the world. And, a lot of the third parties, whether it's sales agents, distributors, consultants, they work for more than one company, often in the same industry. And so, it can be important to make sure you understand what's happening there to bring anybody who's responsible for violating the FCPA through the enforcement process. You do have certain issues that you have to deal with from a privacy standpoint. You've got a lot of, you've got laws in the EU and other places that restrict some of the information you can hand over. And, there are always issues around third parties that you want to be advised of. But, they're just looking to make sure they get the information on, who might be assisting a company in committing a corrupt payment or bribing government officials.
So the next point is about making witnesses available for interviews. And I think the people would understand the importance of that. But my question to you really focuses on overseas employees and then former officers and employees. How have you been able to kind of finesse that issue with someone either coming from outside the U.S. or someone you may not have control over with?
Well, I mean, it depends on whether they're an employee or a former employee. It depends on, whether you're cooperating with the government and somebody is a fact witness versus a potential target. Whether, obviously if you're in-house counsel, you're working on behalf of the corporation, not individuals. Outside counsel, if you're working on behalf of the company or the board of directors, your responsibilities are to the company. And so, then you get into issues about whether people should be individually represented. So, it's really fact specific in terms of how you're going to handle those. You want to make sure individuals have counsel and that they're advised of, what the process and rights are. And, if you can then have them cooperate, there's benefits, both for current and former employees potentially to do so. But they need to do that on their own and certainly not being controlled by company counsel. But, company counsel also should be helping to facilitate those discussions or location of potential witnesses. I mean, that's what the expectation is going to be.
Next up is something I think has concerned the lawyer part of me for quite some time, really going back to the Helicon days of Enron and WorldCom and some of those companies, which is the companies are required to turn over specific facts and sources surrounding their investigation without violating the attorney-client privilege. And it's the attorney-client privilege part that's always concerned me. So how are you able to really navigate that kind of tricky area? When you do a report, is it clear what the facts are as opposed to whatever opinions you might have delivered?
Well, I mean, certainly when you're doing a report, it should be factual-based without opinion in there, especially if it's going to be released anywhere. Because, not only are you concerned about the attorney-client privilege with the DOJ, but you may be concerned about shareholder lawsuits or other types of litigation or employment actions. Once you waive the attorney-client privilege, obviously, then it's waived for all uses and can be very problematic. So you want to make sure that you're thinking about what are you documenting, what's the report going to say, what is going to be protected as attorney-client privilege, and that's always a challenge, obviously, with the Department of Justice in terms of what you ultimately choose to disclose or waive privilege for. And so you've always got to have a delicate balance between cooperating and protecting the corporation at the end of the day and making decisions on what to disclose and what not to disclose. So it's very fact specific, as you look at it. But you also now they're asking for specific sources and individuals, to be attributed to them, and as opposed to just general narratives, which can also lead to more problems, not the least of which is in the employment context.
The next two I'm going to put together because they deal with overseas documents, privacy issues that you alluded to, and production or at least facilitation of third-party production of documents and witnesses from foreign jurisdictions. And with FCPA, most likely third party is going to be outside the United States. But there's a part in it that notes where the company claims that a disclosure of documents or information is prohibited by a foreign country's law. The burden is on the company to establish that prohibition. And I think, at least in Europe, there's still open questions as to what documents or information can be brought back or at least taken out of Europe or certain countries in Europe. How would you go about either thinking through that issue or actually making a presentation that you couldn't get documents out?
Well, I mean, this is a very complicated issue that causes a lot of problems now in these international investigations because you have the EU privacy laws, you've got very serious data protection laws now coming out of Russia, you've got issues in China that can be with state secrets that can be very difficult to handle. So it's country by country specific, and it can also it also depends on what kind of information might be processed or moved and where it's located, and so you've got to go through a data privacy and protection analysis before you're transferring information and making sure that it's going to not violate laws, because you can both have civil and criminal violations potentially of that. And so you have to figure out, what do you have access to? What do you potentially have the right to move? What could be disclosed to a government authority? And then how do you handle those? And, the Department of Justice certainly knows this is a very complicated issue, and they deal with similar things when they're trying to go through the process to gather information from foreign law enforcement as well. And so, they understand it. I mean, I think being reasonable and showing them that you're trying to be very diligent about it goes a long way. And then you try to figure out how you can best work through whatever the specific issue might be country by country.
And then the last one speaks to having documents translated. And I would have said that that's something everyone knows about. But when I said that on a prior document retention, you said that doesn't always happen as well. So perhaps I should ask you, is that something that companies really don't appreciate the need for or would take care of?
You mean in terms of translating documents?
Right.
No, I mean, I think, certainly investigation counsel knows that they have to translate and understand documents. Companies, as they're going through normal business, one of the issues they have internationally is that they can lose visibility or transparency into transactions, whether it's third parties or other business initiatives, just based on the fact that the folks in the U.S. don't understand what's being written in Chinese or Russian or Italian. And, so you can quickly start having problems from a compliance standpoint just because you didn't understand what the business was doing because you couldn't understand the language. And then when you have an investigation going on and you're trying to do document reviews or forensic reviews in countries, you have to go through the translation process. It can be very time consuming, expensive, and a difficult process, but it's the only way to understand what situation's actually happening out there.
Great. Stephen, I'd now like to turn to the third part, which is the remediation. And if I could introduce this one a little bit, because it seemed to me that the department was talking about things closer or near and dear to our hearts, which is actually doing compliance. And they set forth some criteria that were at least focused or stated in ways that I don't think we had seen them talk about before. So it starts off by making an inquiry. And when I say remediation, these are things that the department wants to see a company do during the pendency of an investigation. But it talks about establishing a culture of compliance, including an awareness among employees that criminal conduct, including conduct underlying the investigation, will not be tolerated. And I've heard you talk a lot over the years about certainly code of conduct and communicating that code of conduct, but this seems to me to be far past something like that. This is actually the culture of compliance. And so my question to you would be, if you're sitting across from the DOJ, how would you be able to show that this has been established, that really a culture of compliance has been put forward?
I mean, it's a great question, Tom, because it's very easy for the Department of Justice to say we want a culture of compliance, but it's very hard to show what that really means from a company standpoint. I mean, people use surveys, they use communications to show what's been happening out there, but it's really the holistic. What's the tone at the top from senior management and the board of directors? What's the tone in the middle, from the management and what they're doing? What are business leaders talking about? Is compliance involved in strategic business initiatives? What's your risk management program, at the outset? What are you telling people about how you should conduct business? Is it really all about quarterly profit? So they're looking much more at, and they're doing this certainly, DOJ is, in highly regulated industries like pharma, is, digging into and having companies have to show how do you measure and show that there's a compliance culture here, and that, whether it's from, creating compliance communications trackers to showing, what the senior management and how they're communicating messages, what compliance has been doing, how's that changed over some period of time. But it's a very difficult thing for companies. You hear a lot of companies say we have a great culture and we just, this is how we are. We would never commit a crime, but that doesn't go anywhere with the Department of Justice. You have to show them very specific compliance program elements they think would help establish that culture.
I'm going to put the next two together because certainly the DOJ has talked about resources previously, but here they tied company dedicates sufficient resources to compliance to something I had not seen before, which was that a company's compliance personnel are compensated and promoted comparably to other employees in an organization. So once again, if you're sitting across the table from the DOJ, what are some of the things you would try to put forward to show that a company had met these burdens?
Well, I mean, this goes back to the issue that the DOJ's picked up on, that, the 10 years ago, the compliance function was nothing more than, kind of a paper program. A lot of companies didn't even have it, to compliance now becoming a more professional, established organization, within the companies, to really making sure that compliance is elevated to the senior management C-suite level, with adequate resources and adequate reporting and responsibilities. And what they want to do is they want to say, look, compliance is just as important as your general counsel. Compliance is just as important as your head of HR or your CFO or anybody else. And we want to make sure that that job is at that level and compensated at the same level, as would another senior executive, because that's what we expect to have to show that you're taking it seriously. If you have somebody who is a senior manager who's making, just kind of a low-level salary and, is head of compliance, that's going to show that you don't really care or focused on, this being an important concept in this business.
And there's really two other parts to this I should have thrown in that one, and you touched on them, which are the independence of the compliance function. And I found this interesting because the department has assiduously stayed out of where the compliance function should sit, yet here they're talking about its independence, coupled with the reporting structure of compliance personnel within the company. And it just seems to me that the department has recognized what you said, that compliance needs to be, and the CCO specifically, need to be co-executive with the general counsel, or at least equal, moving forward. So it seems to me to be a little bit different focus.
I mean, I think the Justice Department has, for the most part, stayed out of, the compliance function. And should it be truly independent, meaning is it its own organization? Where should the compliance function report? CFO, general counsel, directly to the CEO, directly to the board of directors, with a dotted line to the CEO or dotted line to the general counsel. I mean, my own personal opinion, I get asked this a lot by clients when we talk about it, is it really depends on the organization and the personnel and the resources available and who's going to be best to oversee it. And you can make multiple decisions based on, those kinds of metrics. And so, I don't think one size fits all. I don't think in a lot of companies you necessarily have a completely independent function, but you do need somebody who has the right level and resources and ability to reach senior management and the board of directors, for any issue that might come up. And so, I think what they're trying to do is emphasize that it can't be compliance is controlled by the business or compliance is controlled by finance or, the general counsel, they're hiring somebody at a lower level than the general counsel doesn't really have any authority.
And then the next one, I would have to say, if it's nearer and dearer to someone's heart, it must be yours, because they talk about an effective risk assessment and tailoring your compliance program on that assessment. And I have heard you speak about risk assessments and how a company can use a risk assessment as a roadmap to tailor their compliance program going forward, even as far out as a 1, 3, and 5-year program. Do you think that this, what the department has said, is something different than that, or would you still advocate what you've been talking about for several years now of that, which I think is that your compliance program is really, your risk assessment is your roadmap for your compliance program?
Yeah, everything, all the pronouncements from the Department of Justice talk about, it being a risk-based program. So, they want you to be evaluating your risk on an ongoing basis and building your compliance program or enhancing it around those. I think the two things that are important for a company that has a compliance program is, A, you want to make sure that you have some documentation of the program's development historically, because if you get asked about the status of the compliance program, that can be very helpful to have. And then you want to have a compliance enhancement plan, which the Department of Justice has made very clear that ongoing enhancement is going to be something that they evaluate. That's a 1 to 3 year plan, perhaps, a 5-year plan, depending on how strategic the company is really looking at issues, but that you have that plan and you execute against the plan to continually enhance the program, again, looking at whatever the risks are, both currently in the business or the risk as they continue to change based on, new partnerships, new opportunities, new strategic business initiatives, anything that changes the risk profile of the business.
Stephen, how would you advise a company about how often to do a risk assessment, or so would you advise an annual or biennial risk assessment coupled with sort of ongoing smaller risk assessment as new risks arise, or how would you help a company think through that process?
There's no requirement set forth by any of the regulatory bodies about how often you have to conduct risk assessments or what you need to do. It's a tough question, Tom, to answer because, it depends on what you're focused on. If you're doing an anti-corruption risk assessment or FCPA-focused risk assessment, then it depends on, where's your company operating? What's the risk profile of the business? Is it low, medium, high risk? What agents and third parties are you using? What jurisdictions? What industry are you in? How broad are you going to do things? Are you going to do a full enterprise-wide risk assessment? Are you going to do regional risk assessments or in-country risk assessments? So generally, I think it's a good idea every few years to kind of look at it at an enterprise level, and in the other years trying to do things in-country, whether you do a sample of countries, maybe you do one per quarter or for a year. This then depends on internal or external resources that you have and the ability to do things. But, setting up a organized plan that is going to look effective is what you're trying to do. And so you can't hit every country every year. Nobody has the resources to really do that. So again, it goes back to being risk-based and practical within your business and within the resources that you have. But it can't be the kind of thing where you just simply say, we don't have any budget in our compliance, budget for it. So
This is Tom Fox again. I'd like to thank you for listening to this episode of the FCPA Compliance and Ethics Report, and I apologize for that abrupt ending. My technical skills on editing leave something to be desired even at this point. I hope you will join me again, and you will also check out my other podcasts, which are Into the Weeds with Matt Kelly, and Unfair and Unbalanced, a podcast with Roy Snell and Tom Fox. This is Tom Fox. I'd like to thank you very much for listening.